Merhaba. 7
Hello.
Nisan
So, 7th April World Health Day. The World Health Organization country office in Turkey organizes the Leave No One Behind Film Days within the scope of 7th April World Health Day to highlight this year's theme, Together for a Fairer, Healthier World. So we pay attention to the professional healthcare workers in 2021, and we are going to remember how important they are. So today we are going to discuss about mental health and psychosocial support, and we have a documentary called Island of the Hungry Ghosts, and the director Gabrielle Brady is with us. Welcome, Gabrielle. And she is from Australia, actually an Australian documentary filmmaker, and also she studied documentary in Cuba, and then she traveled the world, Cuba, Mongolia, Indonesia, and Australian Central Desert, and Europe. So she traveled all around, and she had the island, the short film, and The Island of the Hungry was the first feature film. So today we have Dr. Akfer Kahiroğulları, the next speaker, and graduated from Ankara University Medical Faculty of Medicine in 2000 and received the title of psychiatrist in 2006. After completing her compulsory service, she has been working in WHO, and she worked in the mental health and also the main plans and the community-based mental health services, schizophrenia and migrant health. And we have another guest, Didem Arıkan Çolak, graduated from the Department of Psychology in Hacettepe University and working as clinical psychology. And also she has worked together with refugees, and she has been focusing on the psychological effects. So she focuses on preventive and correct intervention, psychosocial support to reduce personal psychological goals in the field of humanitarian aid. And also she's been working together on site with WHO, and also she is working in the Association for Solidarity with Asylum Seekers and Migrants, so briefly ASAM. So once again, I would like to welcome you all, and now I would like to come back to Gabrielle. Actually, we have seen various documentaries, various films, so we have watched them, and most of them were focusing on the individuals in need, the patients. So psychiatrist, a healthcare worker, now we see the difficulties, the challenges, the hopelessness, the helplessness of this person. So how did you decide on making this film?
Thank you so much for having me today in your panel. So there was a lot of decisions around Poh Lin as the main character for this film, or one of the main people that we come to enter in on the story. One was that Poh Lin is actually a very close friend of mine. So the way I arrived at the story was through her. I was first visiting the island as a tourist. And when I was there, I got to hear a lot of the stories of what was happening on the island through Poh Lin. So it was very organic that I would start to spend time with her, and that, you know, as we made the film together, that we would start to show her perspective. Another huge reason was that, you know, there's this entire center on Christmas Island that no one had ever accessed before. So when I was first starting to make the film, the biggest question was, how can you tell a film about a place that you can't get access to? It's a high security detention facility. It's like a prison. So again, that was another reason that we would go through the perspective of Poh Lin, you know, who was witnessing and seeing it every day, but not from inside the place, but from the psychological effect. And I think, you know, when I was first talking about the project, I would tell people, you know, it's actually a gift that we couldn't get inside the detention center, because if you did get in there and you had a hidden camera, what would you see? You would see people sitting around. Like, the real trauma, the real horror is in the psychological effect that it had on the people that were living in this indefinite detention. So the story was really, how do we make visible this trauma and this psychological effect? And a way of doing that was to be able to go through the gaze of Poh Lin and her work inside of the therapeutic room.
Evet, aslında o oda
Actually, that therapeutic room, it's a very interesting cell. It's like a cell, you know. When I call it cell, I'm talking as the cell of the human body at the same time, because everything is going on that cell. You know, the suffers, the traumas, the pain, and she experiences all of them. She feels them, but she cannot do anything because they cannot come to the next appointment. She cannot understand what happens. When she calls, she cannot get sufficient amount of information. So sometimes we can see that this is not considered. I mean, it's like a bureaucratic barrier in front of all those health services, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, when we were talking about how we would do this filming and what we would show, a big part of the difference for Poh Lin was when she first arrived to the island working as a therapist to the people in the detention center. She describes it that it was incredibly difficult. You would face, you know, really difficult stories of the journey over and the uncertainty of what was happening or the trauma that people had experienced back in their homeland. But it was manageable, you know, because her work was to sit with people, to listen to their stories. But eventually, within 3 months, people were then given a visa to go back to, you know, to go and live in Australia. So there was a cycle to that. There was a way out. But as the time went on, those 3 months led to 6 months, led to 12 months, led to 2 years, led to 3 years, led to indefinite detention. So the whole nature of her work changed. You know, her work was to support people in that time before they got a visa. But suddenly her work became, you know, listening to people whose trauma was occurring and being, you know, instated by the Australian government and by the officials who were keeping them in indefinite detention. So the very nature of her work changed, you know, and this was a huge part of the reason for leaving, like we see in the film that she describes. How can I be part of a system that is just aiming to keep people in this trauma position? And that's when she made the decision to leave. So yeah, absolutely, that room for her and the room for me as a filmmaker, her therapy space was very much about a symbolic space of the intimacy of what people were experiencing inside of that detention facility, that we could get a feeling for it, even though we're just in an encounter with them, we get a feeling for it also inside of that space.
evet. Ben hemen
Yes. Okay, now I would like to come back to Akfer and Didem. So what did you feel when you watched the helplessness of Pauline? We can start with Dr. Akfer, because you know, she's a colleague of yours. It's a very difficult situation, isn't it? So when we watched the film for the first time, it was, I mean, we were planning to discuss the health of the refugees. Then I thought maybe I would not be the right person to discuss that, because, you know, I was going to put myself into that person's own position. And the first feeling that I felt is the burnout, the problems. I mean, of course, there will be different reasons to increase that. One of the problems can be bureaucracy. Another one can be the lack of resources. Or in another place in the world, maybe there will be another problem for other psychosocial workers or psychologists. But something is very clear. You know, the uncertainty experienced by Pauline due to bureaucracy is the case of all mental health care workers, because this is the burnout, and this contributes a lot to the burnout feeling, because we can feel that from our own experiences for the last couple of years, because there is an uncertainty due to the COVID-19. There is a negative effect on us. And imagine this uncertainty is felt by mental health care workers, and they're working together with refugees. So they are going to feel that at every single point, of course, all those experienced traumas, we have been educated, I mean, in order to protect ourselves while listening to those traumas. But of course, if it is continuous, I mean, when you listen to those traumas, and if you do that without any supervision in terms of care for yourself, if you do not take the significant steps to take care of yourself, then it's a very challenging position. So we're talking about this burnout. So I would like to give floor to Dr. Didem. So this is one of your field for work, because you've been working for a very long time with refugees, and you try to decrease the psychological effects on the personnel providing support to those refugees and migrants. First of all, actually, I could not become a doctor yet, so I will make a clarification. I'm a clinical psychologist. I will complete my PhD in the future, I hope. So while I watched the film, there were two different main factors for me, because I've been working together with refugees and asylum seekers, and I started on site working together with the children for child protection, and it's really tiring. So then, as Akfer stated, there could be some insufficiencies, for example, could not reach to the sources, and even if we can access to those resources, we cannot find solutions for some of the problems. And then we started such activities for psychosocial support for the personnel working with migrants and refugees. And that uncertainty feeling, when you feel that uncertainty, the therapists, we can feel that helplessness, and she also adapted that helplessness on herself. I mean, we can experience that on site. I can experience that because the counselees come to us and we tried our best in this mental health field and also for the protection. But then we realized that we have specific conditions and we have some limits. So we can go to a specific point. And here in the film, we can also see that those counselees can harm themselves. And in that documentary, this was the final point. Poh Lin felt that I cannot help all those individuals. So why am I here? So this was the idea. So I can observe that while I'm working on the site, because as I've stated, we try to focus on the solution all the time. We try to focus on saving the lives. In quotation mark, you know, we try to become superheroes, heroines, and this makes us feel that burnout. And here I observed this case in the documentary, you know, not being able to help, and all those individuals giving harm to themselves. So feeling that helplessness, desperation. So we call it like a secondary trauma in literature. It was very similar when we look at the effects, because all those effects were experienced by the psychiatrist. So when I listen to those traumas, yes, we can have such problems. For example, we can have some sleeping disorders. We can have some eating problems. I mean, you experience that trauma. You try to think of all those ideas. You try to remember. You try to remember all those stories in your mind. I mean, you always try to elaborate that in your mind. But one of the issues is to focus on self-care in order to protect yourself and in order to use some resources for self-care. Thank you very much. So, Gabrielle, there was a camp scene with the family, and then Poh Lin could not embrace all those tragedies, and we realized that she broke all the branches of the tree. It was so moving, you know, she could not feel, she could not reflect his pain. So how did you shoot that scene?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of the scenes that I filmed with Poh Lin were very much in collaboration with her. We would have a lot of discussions every day. We were doing a lot of exercises together, like co-writing, performance exercises, these kind of things that could lift the experience out of her and in her internal world. So we could look to see how we can find a vision for it, how we can find a scene that can show that. So a lot of it was just incredibly collaborative. It came from Poh Lin and her lived experience. And I think, you know, because we have such a long history of a friendship, we've known each other for over 10 years, we had that trust and that kind of connection that she felt safe to be able to explore those difficult moments with me and with the camera. And I think, you know, for her, a big intention was to also be very honest, you know, to not try to be this therapist that knows everything. No, in fact, it was more so that she was being, you know, affected along with the people she was working with. And I know a huge intention for her was, if I'm asking these people to be part of this film project, you know, and then in a way, then I feel as though I have to be part of it as well. And I have to be as honest as they're willing to be. And so that was a big intention for her, was to show that honesty, to see how much of a ripple effect this system is having, not just, you know, on the people being detained at the very core of it, you know, but also all of the people that are wound up inside of that system. No one's, you know, no one's a winner. Everyone's a loser inside of this system. And so that was, you know, another huge intention for her.
Doktor Akfer, peki bu herkes...
Dr. Akfer, so this system, everyone is the loser. And one of the counselees, what was he saying? Iranian, I suppose, because of the accent of that person. The hell, you know, when you feel, when you see that your families, your relatives suffer from the pain, that's the hell for you. So when you listen to those listener, Poh Lin listening, then the reactions, what would you say as a psychiatrist? Actually, there were some conflicts for Poh Lin, because there were stories, listening to those stories, it's really difficult, I can imagine. And, you know, all those individuals imagine reaching to a heaven first, because the island was so nice. You know, maybe the plan, the dream was to continue the life with the family in that heaven island. But then listening to the stories of the hell, so I suppose it was very difficult for her. And I'm not sure the crabs, you know, maybe this was selected particularly on purpose, because all those crabs migrated for laying the eggs. You know, those roots for the crabs, for special protections, for all those crabs to lay their eggs in the ocean. So, you know, we can observe the migration area, because there are the routes changing every day for all those crabs. But on the other hand, there is another bottleneck for another migration route for the individuals. So there is a conflict. And I paid attention to the conversations with the kids, because she had some conversation with them, and migration transferred to the next generation. So she listened to those stories from the next generation, the secondary trauma. You know, there are some wounds to be cured, but still, you know, they fly, they did some rituals for the ones who died, who lost their lives in the ocean. On the other hand, from her own point of view, trying to explain the things to the kids. So there are conflicts, too many conflicts for her. And I believe, I thought her life was very difficult. So we move to the different elements in the film. So I come back to Gabrielle once again. I believe you discovered something different, something else in that island. The local residents, they also moved to the island with a migration. You know, there were different rituals and the crabs, all those red crabs, maybe thousands of years, maybe they had the migration, but now we see that with the migration of the individuals, in order to continue their migration, you know, the routes were changed, villages were established by the voluntaries. So we can see that the natural habitat, you know, there was a way through their natural habitat. It was like a genocide for the crabs. So this was tried to be prevented. So the first migrants, they lost because of hunger hundreds of years ago. But now the newcomers, the migrants, you know, still there is a lack of respect. So with all those parallelism, how did you start structuring those parallelism? How did you start writing them? I mean, I would like to learn about this formation phase.
Yeah, I mean, I think initially the idea for the film came from conversations with Poh Lin. And at the time, Poh had, you know, invited me to come to the island, thinking that we would start to document some of her work, some of the stories from the people inside the detention facility, to document it before it was lost, you know, because there was a real sense of everything being swept under the carpet in terms of the, you know, the Australian officials. But of course, that would just be a document. You could make a radio documentary, you could make a book, you could make it, like, why is it a film? And so for me, it was very much about spending time on the island and being witness to the rhythms of the island, both within the nature, both within the local inhabitants. And in that started to surface these really rich parallels and these very rich, you know, metaphors that could start to build a kind of image for the film. As I said earlier, it's about a place that we can't get access to, this detention center. And yet I never wanted to get access to it. How do we actually instead evoke the feeling through the sensation of the island? And so, of course, the first step was the crabs. It was such a blaring metaphor. It was such an obvious metaphor that, in fact, the work was to not create it as a dichotomy, to not create this very didactic feeling of, oh, they're taking care of crabs, but not humans, you know, and that's the only story there. So to open it up, I felt that it was really necessary to bring in this third layer, which was the history of the island. The ancient way that it's existed without people, that it's one of the last discovered places on Earth, and that the very people that have arrived there were migrating there to seek a better way of life, and were treated in incredibly cruel ways, you know. And so the feeling of that inhabiting space of ghosts, as these ghosts watch what is happening today, the feeling that I wanted to evoke was that history is repeating itself. You know, we need to look big. Once we look small, we lose the sense of what is actually happening in this picture, which is that there's an incredibly cruel policy in place that is stopping people from seeking safety, and it's not illegal to seek safety. So this was the intention with bringing those strands together inside of the film.
Evet, teşekkür ederim.
Thank you, Miss Didem. So you're working in Assam, Association for Solidarity with Asylum Seekers and Migrants. So have you seen all those individuals having heavy traumas? They're stayed in detention centers, feeling in between. So how do they affect it?
Yani gerçekten bu aslında hani sağladığımız işte ruh sağlığı hizmetini
Actually, we provide mental health care services, but this is a very changing question, because in case of emergencies or in case of high risky conditions, maybe there could be no status, no identities. So we can have some counselings within higher risk groups, and there could be the inequalities, difficulties and challenges. So they are more and they are a higher burden on them because they can have much more different issues before mental health care. Maybe they can have the previous mental health problem, or due to being a minority, this person can have another problem in his or her own
statüden kaynaklı
country. But when this person moves to another country, there could be additional problems, leaving the family behind, psychosocial status or identity. In the film, this was also very moving to see, you know, that social support. We could see that there is no social support. All those individuals are staying away from the families, staying away from the social channels, and how those people affected by those channels and the safety, you know, in those current conditions when you go to another country or in the center, safety condition and safe spaces for those individuals. And this safety can only be felt in that therapy room. And also, when we work in this field, sometimes we focus on the information. There could be lack of information. So when we work together with migrants and refugees, sometimes it could be much more difficult and challenging working in the field of mental health. So we have a pyramid. And at the bottom of this pyramid, we have the safety and the fundamental needs. These should be provided. This is also the ones to be provided for primary health care, you know, the accommodation, water. So these are the fundamental needs, whether they are provided or safety. So this person should feel safe, or will there be any violence? So first we start working with that pyramid. We start from the bottom line, then we go further to the second step. Will there be any family support? So we go up further, and then we can have focus on the special services. And for example, the feeling of control. So we try to give that control feeling to that person. We also work on that. This was very moving. This was very moving for me in the film, because if we cannot provide that feeling, the control feeling to that person, then this person starts to feel that control in her on his own body. So he or she harms herself or himself. For this reason, we could create that safe space for that individual. So this is also from the bottom line services. And once again, you know, sealing the mouth and showing the desperation as such. And then we realized that 20 people continued acting as such. And the main reason can be like, you know, this person cannot control her own life. There is no social support. I cannot access to those services. So this control will be performed in my own body. So this will be my way of expressing that control. So this was so moving for me. Dr. Akfer, probably these were all cases you have seen in your real life, right? Have you seen that parallelism? Yes. Generally, I don't provide services on site for the last couple of years, but yes, we can see all those cases very frequently and very common reactions. So sad. I mean, we all discussed from the point of view of the therapist, but also we have the service users, the desperation of all those service users, and they have different ones. For example, feeling there is no tongue, I mean, losing the tongue, or not expressing herself, or sacrificing herself. And actually, they came to this island. I mean, they passed through the ocean, very difficult conditions, leaving the family behind. So tolerating all these conditions. So after a very long phase, you know, taking the decision of quitting stopping his or her own life. It's a very difficult decision, and this could be a very major trauma to be accepted in general practical therapies. And when you try to help, you know, this person doesn't want to live anymore. And as far as I understand, this was the case for Poh Lin. And personally, I always go back to my own past. I mean, I went back to my last 20 years and I was always thinking, yes, I was afraid of those feelings. I mean, I had that fear for some of my counselings. I felt that fear, and I had thankful for some of the cases because I did not go that beyond for some of my counselees. Yes, this was so desperate, feeling that, and you can feel the reflection. I mean, of course, you try to keep your distance, but it was very difficult for you. So, Gabrielle, for the opening sequence, it was fiction, right? Escaping, going to the jungle, and then hopelessness, and we hear that scream, desperate scream. That scene, you know, this was like the escape, the riot of all those migrants from my point of view. So you shot that scene and you put that at the initial scene. So how did you plan and design to put that scene at the initial phase of your film?
Yeah, so that scene came from an experience while I was on the islands. A story I was reading was about a young man, a young Farsi man, and his situation was that he had arrived on Christmas Island and he'd spent, I think, 2 years there, and he'd then been given a visa and had moved to Melbourne. But due to the bureaucratical process, they were able to actually take him from Melbourne, and he was put back into the Christmas Island detention centre. And so there his mental health really deteriorated, and one night he was able to escape the centre, and his body was found 2 days later inside of the jungle. And it just really haunted me, this story. There's so many stories you hear about what people have to suffer through this time. But I kept wondering, what did he do for that time? You know, because in a way he was free, but you're never really free. I mean, this is the thing, you're being imprisoned on an island, you leave and you're still imprisoned. And I always wondered what had happened in that time. And I felt he needed to be honored some way inside of the film. And so I wrote this as a very fiction, feeling, and absolutely that scream, in a way, it's to tell us from the beginning that there's so many words in this film, but there's actually not really words to describe the kind of pain that people experience inside of this place. What do you do when there are no words? The body is telling you something even deeper, and of something of a deeper horror that may not have words at that time. And so in a way, it's telling the audience that from the very beginning with this scream. And although it's based on the one young man's story, absolutely, like you said, it's a feeling of that sheer desperation that we come to experience through all the people that are forced to go through this system. So it's everyone's experience through that scream.
Evet, çok çarpıcı
Yes.
aslında. Yani o çığlık.
That scream, this was the tone, I mean, for the entire film. And also it was so striking, the burnout and also the chaos. Yes, everything was summarized. And while Gabrielle was speaking, not expressing what you think, Poh Lin had some patients and she couldn't continue for the therapy with all those patients. So what happens to them? I mean, when you cut the therapy in between, so what kind of a deterioration happens? First of all, it's really difficult to establish that trust relationship. So first of all, you establish that trust relationship with a foreigner, I mean a stranger, and you're the place where you don't want to stay. So safety is very important, and you can experience that in another language because you can express yourself with some limited words. This was a very good strategy, very logical strategy expressed by Gabrielle, because moving that sand from the ocean in order to express the feelings, the emotions. So some tools were used, but somehow, I mean, it was so difficult to establish that trust relationship. And then suddenly this relationship quits. And without the approval, without the permission of those two parties. So the basic feeling is the trust, the sense of trust. When you destroy that sense of trust, then you destroy all the established, constructed structure. So the investment made on that relationship, everything was lost. And Miss Didem, the method of Poh Lin, this was the first time I've seen it. I mean, collecting the sand, little figures, some tools to be used, because all those individuals cannot express themselves, the feelings, the ideas. You know, this was a kind of way of expressing themselves without those words. When those words were not sufficient, this was a kind of composition. So could you please elaborate that for us?
Aslında hani Gabrielle Hanım da çok böyle
Actually, Miss Gabrielle emphasized that, you know, expressing that trauma with words, it's not really easy and it's not really possible. And when you try to express them with words, then there will be the treatment. We can experience that the treatment comes after expressing themselves with words. So the use of all those scents, the toys, the figures. So this means that sometimes this is the projective method. You use the toys, the scents, some different tools, then it becomes more meaningful for the counseling, and it can be easier for those people to express themselves. During our therapies, especially with kids, for example, it could be sexual abuse or something similar. This could not be understood by the kid. So we use such methods, little toys, tiny toys, or sometimes family figures in order to have that flashback, or we can show some of the rooms of the house. So we try to play some games. And if a person has traumas, you cannot ask the question like, what do you feel? You cannot receive the answers. First, you ask, what do you feel? What do you feel about that? When you play with those scents, what do you feel? How do you feel? Then the trauma can be expressed. So it facilitates that process. And it facilitates for bringing all those connotations. Okay, thank you. It was very striking. It was a very impressive method. Maybe Dr. Akfer can briefly state that method for us. Actually, Didem said everything. If individuals cannot explain themselves, if they cannot find a way out, this could be with various reasons. There could be children or adult patients, counselors. Maybe they cannot express themselves verbally. Maybe this method can be selected for the language barrier, or there could be a structured interview, and this could be the method for that interview. So this trauma could be projected, and then this method will be used to initiate that conversation. If I'm correct, I don't know, maybe Poh Lin used the same method. Maybe Gabrielle can know the right answer, but this was the reflection maybe. But this is a common method used by the therapist. So this can be a unique method used, and it was very nice to see such methods. And Gabrielle, I believe this was a tool used by Poh Lin the sands, all those mini figures, right?
Absolutely. This wasn't something concocted for the film. This is Poh Lin's approach. So, you know, I'm no therapist, but from what I understand in what she's shared with me, she practices a type of therapy called narrative therapy. And as part of that, she does this practice of sand play. And it's always been part of her work, I believe, is finding a way, as we're talking about, that can also serve people to not just speak about what's happened to them, but to find a way to express it through words or through the body or through, you know, through the way of these figurines. And in fact, when we were first talking about the film, it was really important to Poh Lin that I understand what sand session, you know, where I did a sand therapy session myself, and that was incredibly helpful to really be there in that process and see the way it works. And it was an incredibly powerful method. Yeah, so that was very much born out.
Küçük bir bağlantı sorunu oldu zannediyorum. Gabrielle bize bağlandığı noktada zaten artık
There was a connection problem, so we are at the end of our talk. So maybe I can ask for your final words until Gabrielle comes back. So I would like to take your final words, Dr. Akfer, Miss Didem. Thank you very much. It was very enjoyable for me. I mean, it was very pleasant for me. I hope everyone watching will also feel that sense. And Miss Gabrielle, we have lost you for a couple of minutes, so maybe you would like to complete your final sentence.
Sorry, I'm unmuted there. So just finishing that was that, yeah, absolutely, the sand therapy was very much about the way Poh Lin was practicing in her work, but also for the film, it allowed us to visually go inside of people's experiences. So it was also another huge gift for the film, that we could go into their experience without just hearing it, you know, because of course film is a visual medium. So it was a really interesting tool to be able to play with in the film.
Evet, hepinize çok
Okay, thank you very much for being here with us. It was so lyric, tragic, moving, and it was very successful at the same time. So we have watched that film, and I would like to thank for your contributions. So we once again say leave no one behind, and film days and all those talks can be followed from Festival Scope's website until the 11th of April, free of charge. So we are not going to leave no one behind.